Good morning, everyone. So, we are going to continue talking about sex offenders today. Today, what we are going to do is talk about the different types of treatments that are available for them. In the other class, we did not get to the residence restrictions and registration. We'll see if we get through them with you guys. If not, we'll discuss that starting on Friday. But should we go ahead and get to that, I have gone ahead and pulled up the sex offender registry for the Charleston area and zeroed in on the Citadel so that we can take a look at the sex offenders living around you guys. But chances are we won't get till Friday, so you might want to stay tuned for that. All right, any questions before we get started? Nothing? All right. Okay. All right, let's skip to where, whoop, there we go. All right, so the first treatment we are going to talk about today is behavioral treatment. So this is modeled after the old classical conditioning. If you think of Pavlov's dog, this is exactly what we're talking about here, but for sex offenders. So these programs are based on the theories of behaviorism and were molded specifically for sex offenders. So the goal here is the modification of inappropriate sexual preferences. And behavioral therapists are less concerned about whether this individual has an underlying disorder that's causing this. So they don't really care why this person is committing these offenses. All they care about is just changing the observed behaviors in which this person engages. So the first part of this treatment is the assessment. So we have to figure out what sort of inappropriate things this person likes so that we can start to teach them to associate those things with something negative. So the assessment is through self-report, so extensive interviews with therapists trying to understand what this person likes. They are looking through their criminal history. They're talking to doctors. They're talking to victims if it's possible. If not, they're just sort of reading police records, stuff like that. So they're combing through all the files, talking to the people that they need to talk to. And lastly, what they might be doing is giving various sexual stimulus tests. So if this person is claiming this is not something that they prefer, but the records indicate otherwise, they might give them a sexual stimulus test to see if in fact this is some sort of preference that they have. So once they know exactly the inappropriate thing that this person likes, then they can begin trying to associate that with something negative.
What's that test again?
It's called just the assessment, but one of the ways they do it might be the sexual stimulus test. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, that's what I was asking.
Yeah, it's exactly what it sounds like. They show them pictures and see if they get excited, pictures or videos. It's not just like a visual assessment. They also will have them like hooked up to like a heart monitor and stuff like that. So they can kind of triangulate the information to see if this is in fact something that they like. So once they've pinpointed exactly what this person likes, then they can try to, like I said, associate it with something negative. And there are two common techniques that are used for this. So the first one is aversion therapy. So this is modeled after the old shock treatments, but we can't shock people anymore. It's not ethical. We have not used shock treatments since the early 1970s. So what we do instead of shocking people now is we either show them this inappropriate image or video, and it's immediately followed by some sort of aversive stimuli like ammonia smelling salts, which make you feel really ill if you've ever smelled them before. There's also a flower where if you like dry the leaves and crush it up, there's a flower that smells like a rotting corpse. So you can have them smell that as well. So that's aversion therapy. It can be physical, like the ammonia smelling salts or smelling the dried leaves of the flower that smells terrible, or it can be visual. So what you might have is like the picture of the inappropriate thing. followed immediately by a picture of like a rotting corpse with like maggots in it or something disgusting, right? And you just like keep doing that over and over and over again until they start to associate whatever their inappropriate sexual preference is with something negative, with feeling ill, right? So smelling that ammonia smelling salt, seeing the rotting corpse, smelling the rotting corpse from the dried leaves of that flower. So that is aversion therapy. The next one is covert sensitization, and covert sensitization is used more often now than aversion therapy is. And it's very similar. The only difference is you have the offender talk through both sets of it. So you have the offender picture and describe their inappropriate preference, followed by describing something negative. So they can be describing an extremely noxious or nauseating scene, like I said, like a rotting corpse or something like that, or maybe feelings of intense shame and guilt, or perhaps severe legal consequences. So both of these things you're supposed to do over and over and over again until it becomes second nature, that anytime you think about or see this inappropriate sexual preference, you either start to feel sick, your brain starts to smell the thing that it's used to smelling, or you start to feel intensely shameful and guilty, or immediately flash to like severe legal consequences. Questions? Oh, Sam, you have a question?
Yeah, so it would also like be the same thing, we got like, Bob the pervert walking around, sees whatever his preference is and automatically thinks, oh, I like that, but wait, there's now rotting corpses in my head every single time. That's kind of the idea.
Yes, we're hoping that they don't even think, oh, I like that. We're hoping that
they can't get to that point because they're so associated with dead bodies and gross stuff.
Yes, exactly. Hopefully, the thing that they don't like is dead bodies, because if that's the case, then that's not the aversive stimuli that we would use, which is why the assessment is so important. So we know exactly what behavior to be using as the inappropriate, the first stimuli. So
yeah, I was going to ask about that, but didn't really want to bring that up at 9 o'clock in the morning because that's kind of gross.
Brought it up for you, and I also had to teach this class at 8 a.m. So I don't know which one's worse. Other questions about behavioral treatment?
Yes. So one is through visual and the other one is through smell, I guess. Is that?
Yeah. So aversion therapy is like the physical, like you're smelling it or you're seeing it, and covert is like imagining it and like describing it. So it's all in your head for covert sensitization. That's what if you want to think of the word covert, like it's more subtle, if that makes sense. All right, any other questions about this treatment? All right, so these are not nearly as common as the next couple of treatments that we're going to talk about. And in one of the last slides we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about, of the treatments we talk about, which are the most effective. This is the least effective of the treatments. All right, so all the men's favorite, let's talk about the medical. So this approach focuses on the biological perspective of the causes of sex offending. So there are two ways to do this. You can do this with hormonal manipulation, or you can do it through chemical or surgical castration. So let's start with hormonal manipulation. So the point here is just to lower the physiological drive of the offenders. So they will give them something, some sort of hormone that makes them very unlikely or impossible to get excited about something. So if you've ever heard of Depo-Provera, that is the most common hormone that is given to keep this person from getting stimulated. So if you kind of want to think back to when we talked about the drug treatment programs, when you're looking at this medical perspective, it's kind of like when we talked about like detox and methadone maintenance, that addresses the physical addiction. So this medical will deal with the physical. but it's also important to include a mental aspect as well. So usually these medical treatments are used in conjunction with some sort of therapy. So most commonly, if you're going to be getting the Depo-Provera, the hormonal manipulation that makes it impossible for you to get stimulated, usually you're also in psychotherapy as well. We kind of want to approach this from the physical and the mental. This will deal with the physical, and the psychotherapy or other type of treatment will deal with the mental. So the type of offender that is getting this medical treatment is a really, really bad offender. This is usually that 4% that we were talking about, not the like average sex offender that just commits a litany of other crimes as well. If you are getting hormonal manipulation or chemical or surgical castration, you are a very serious offender. So part of the reason why we want to give you psychotherapy as well is because a common characteristic of this type of sex offender is something we refer to as self-deception. So self-deception is the rationalization that your actions are enjoyable to the victim. So this is why they need psychotherapy. So if we make it so that they no longer have the physiological sex drive, we still need to deal with the self-deception that's happening in their head. So again, this is the rationalization that their actions are enjoyable to the victim. So I've interviewed a few sex offenders, but I've also spoken to my friend Ryan Shields, who specializes in sex offenders, about this. And the two of us have heard some really disturbing things regarding self-deception. So sometimes what you might hear a sex offender say is that a child was flirting with them. And the way that they view it is the kid was either wearing a skirt or shorts, or they were simply talking to this adult. And the way that they see it, this kid was kind of asking for it. Or if the victim is screaming and writhing in pain, they view that as pleasure, not pain. So this is exactly why just manipulating the hormones or chemically or surgically castrating is not enough. We need to counteract that self-deception with intensive psychotherapy. So using psychotherapy can be very helpful in teaching offenders to recognize these flaws and learn to resist their urges.
Dr. Hill.
Yes.
So you said that this one was made for the more, let's say, aggressive sex offenders, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the other cases or points that determine what sex offender gets what treatment?
So we can't force this treatment on anyone. They have to volunteer for it. So this is something that we might see with someone that's being civilly committed. What we saw recently, there was a state, I forget which state it was, but they offered their high-risk sex offenders that were incarcerated, they offered them the option to spend the rest of their sentence in the community if they volunteered for one of these medical treatments. I mean, they, were still being monitored. Most likely they had to also wear an electronic monitor, receive the therapy. But this is also very, very expensive. So this isn't something that we want to waste on the average sex offender that doesn't need this. This is for the worst of the worst. But they have to volunteer for the treatment. The type of person that usually volunteers for this is someone that is so disgusted by their own behavior that they're willing to do anything to save other people from themselves, if that makes sense.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, but it really depends on the state. It depends on the budget. It depends on the type of sex offenders they have there. It depends on a lot of things. But this treatment is usually reserved for the worst of the worst, that 4% that we were kind of talking about on Monday. All right, so that's hormonal manipulation. What we're just doing here is lowering the physiological drive of the offenders. The other option is to lower their testosterone through chemical or surgical castration. So surgical castration sounds exact. I mean, it sounds like what it is. We snip, snip here. What is more common now is doing this chemically. So we will see with this one, what offenders are usually given is the female hormone progesterone, which will lower their testosterone considerably. We see their balls kind of shrivel right up. Sometimes they stop growing facial hair. Sometimes they start growing breasts. This is, like I said, not something that a lot of offenders volunteer for, but we can't force them to do this for all the ethical reasons that you could possibly think of. But the point here, the two medical approaches that we have, we've got the hormonal manipulation, which will lower the physiological drive, or the chemical or surgical castration, which will lower the testosterone. Both of them have the same effect in that this person can't really get aroused anymore. Questions about this stuff? No questions about this? Would we like to move on to a different treatment that doesn't involve this stuff? Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's the medical. Let's talk about cognitive behavioral. So we have talked about cognitive behavioral treatments before. One of the things that's so great about cognitive behavioral treatments is that they can really be modeled or molded to specific types of offenders. So the cognitive behavioral treatment that we're going to talk about today has been modeled specifically for sex offenders. So the treatment here is concerned with teaching the offenders the mental skills necessary for controlling their own behaviors. And just like the other treatments that we've talked about, it's based on the philosophy that offending is a choice. So for this one, it's based on the philosophy that sexual offending is a choice made by the offender over which he or she has cognitive control, albeit limited control, but still cognitive control. Because if you make the argument that they literally cannot control themselves, then cognitive behavioral therapy is not going to work, and perhaps the medical therapy plus psychotherapy is the way to go. So this is based on the social learning model or the cognitive behavioral model. And the treatment is focused on learning to control the cognitive distortions and dysfunctional thought processes of the sex offender. So just like the other cognitive behavioral programs we talked about, they have to monitor their inner dialogue. That's the first step right there, is learning to monitor that inner dialogue. So that's part of the controlling these cognitive distortions, these dysfunctional thought processes. But what is unique to the sex offender version of cognitive behavioral treatment is something we refer to as the relapse prevention approach. So again, it starts by monitoring their inner dialogue, right? And so what the therapist will ask this person to do is to think back to the last couple of times you committed a sex crime. What were like the 5 thoughts that you had before you committed this crime? Or maybe it was 10 thoughts, talk me through the thoughts you had. So what was the first thought that you had that entered your head when you started down this path, right? So say there were 5 thoughts that this person had. Then the therapist is going to say, of those 5 thoughts, what was the thought right before the point of no return? So someone might say, thought number 2 was the last thought that I had before I could make a choice. Once I got to thought number 3, there was no stopping me, right? So you start to recognize the thoughts that you're having. You start to realize when you're getting to the thought where you could still sort of derail this chain of events. And it becomes kind of second nature, right? So they're teaching the offender to identify the warning signs of a relapse. Once they can identify those signs, then they're helping them understand the methods necessary to derail this chain of events that leads to sex offending. So they'll say, okay, so that thought number 2, that's the last time that you could actually change your behavior. What would it take for you to not get to thought number 3? that's going to be different for every offender, whether it's, going on a trip or going for a run or, doing a combination of things. Start thinking about the last time they were incarcerated, maybe reading their diary from when they were incarcerated. Whatever it is that can derail that chain of events, that's what we're looking for this person to identify. So the goal of this treatment here, we're teaching them these self-reinforcement skills and how to monitor their inner dialogue. So like I've mentioned before, this treatment is widely used. Since the 1980s, we've been seeing this treatment all over the place. It's been widely adopted by the correctional field and has been consistently praised as some of the most promising treatments. We see this for sex offenders as well. The only problem with cognitive behavioral treatment is that this is some of the most expensive treatments. It's the success of the treatment is based on its structured and focused nature. It takes a lot of psychiatrists, psychologists, researchers to come up with the treatment that works really well. And it's not cheap. It comes with a really, really thick binder, and it's best if a therapist, a well-trained, well-funded therapist does this. So that is the only downside to cognitive behavioral treatment, is that it is so expensive to implement. But we know that this treatment does work the best. All right, questions about cognitive behavioral treatment? Okay, let's talk about psychotherapy. So this treatment is based on psychodynamic therapy, and it assumes here that people ordinarily develop conventional erotic attractions towards age-appropriate partners. So basically what they're saying is, as long as there was no traumatic event that happened during your childhood, during your development, you will normally develop ordinary or conventional erotic attractions towards age-appropriate people. It's when something happens during your development, usually something traumatic, that has you start to develop unconventional attractions, things, being attracted to things you shouldn't be being attracted to, or being attracted to non-age appropriate people. So that's what psychotherapy is based on, that if you have a normal development, you will turn out fine. If something happens during your development, that is what leads you to become attracted to something inappropriate. So some sort of unhealthy life experience during development interferes with the normal process of maturation and leads to unhealthy attractions. So what they're doing here is using a process called introspection to identify what went wrong in your development. So introspection is you talking with a therapist about looking through your life. So, they'll start with your earliest memory and have you basically walk them through your whole life, so that you and the therapist can understand together what happened to you, and they can sort of frame that in the context so that everybody under you and the therapist can understand why you have this unhealthy attraction. So sometimes you might have to use hypnosis here, because if the unhealthy life event was so traumatic that your brain just stopped remembering it, you'll have to use hypnosis to be able to remember that traumatic event. So basically, you're walking this therapist through your entire life to figure out what went wrong, and to help them, or to let the therapist help you understand how that event led to this unhealthy attraction that you have.
Dr. Hill,
Yes.
when you said that they sometimes use hypnosis, is that like, does that depend on like the ethical like laws or whatever in that state or something like that?
Not necessarily. I mean, hypnosis isn't really something. I mean, it's basically they just, sort of put you in a deep, relaxed state to the point where you can, pull out memories that maybe your brain has shut out. So it's, I mean, again, you have to agree to it. If you absolutely refuse to hypnosis, they can't force you to do it. It's kind of the same with any of these treatments. Like, you have to agree to go to them. What we often will see are incentives. So, like if you just think about the truth in sentencing laws that we passed in the 1980s, you could shave off the last 15% of your sentence if you received your GED, stuff like that. Or when we were talking about the hormonal treatments, whichever state it was said, we'll give you the incentive of serving the rest of your sentence in the community if you agree to do this. So hypnosis isn't really seen as like, something that might cross the ethical lines, kind of like the medical treatments might do. So most of the time, somebody that's in psychotherapy that is dying to understand why they do the things they do are almost willing to try anything, if that makes sense.
Dr. Hill,
Yeah.
couldn't hypnosis also lead to false memories, especially if there's an incentive involved?
Yeah. So they're not just gonna right out the gate, recommend hypnosis. This is something that, if they have been in treatment for a really long time and have been doing this introspection and they physically, like this person cannot remember, or maybe sometimes what happens with the brain with a really traumatic event is they'll remember kind of the beginning of it, but not the rest of it. So there have to be a lot of signs that lead them towards considering the possibility of hypnosis. They might even be interviewing your family to try to figure out if there's something in there that maybe this person has sort of locked away super deep. But I mean, you're absolutely right. There are definitely cons to hypnosis, and this is not something that's used all the time. This is for a really serious case of this person, like the therapist literally can't see any reason why they would have this, or there was some sign that the memory is kind of in there somewhere. So what the whole point of this is, it's kind of assumed here, is that understanding what this person went through is going to facilitate the correction of the problem. So just being able to understand why you are the way that you are can be very, very helpful for these people. So psychotherapy can be offered individually, it can be offered in a group setting, or we might see a combination of the two. So you might do one-on-one therapy like once a week, and then group therapy twice a week or something like that. It depends on the funding. It depends on the therapist. It depends on the therapist's time. It depends on your preferences as well. So some people might prefer not to be sharing these experiences with other people. Others might feel more comforted in knowing that they're not the only ones going through this. So really, there are a lot of factors that determine whether this is offered individually in a group setting or kind of the combination of the two. Other questions about psychotherapy? Okay. So let's start talking about the effectiveness of these treatments. So there was a fantastic meta-analysis that was published quite a few years ago at this point, in 1995. And what they were looking at was which of these treatments seemed to work the best. So there are a couple of findings from this study that I want to talk about today. So they were looking at all of the treatments for sex offenders. And what they found was that both the cognitive behavioral treatments and the hormonal treatments appeared to be superior to the behavioral treatments. So it seems like the behavioral treatments don't work nearly as well as cognitive behavioral or hormonal treatments. So what we saw here was that the cognitive behavioral and the hormonal treatments both showed a medium effect size compared to other treatments or to no treatment at all. So if you're going to pick any treatment, you should probably pick cognitive behavioral or the hormonal. They work better than the other treatments, or no treatment at all. So, of course, they want to know, well, which one's the best? So then when trying to compare cognitive behavioral versus hormonal, what they found was that there were no significant differences. So in terms of preventing recidivism, it appeared that cognitive behavioral and hormonal worked exactly the same. That's what I mean when I say no significant differences under there. However, what the researchers are thinking is that this most likely had to do with the refusal rate. So just judging from the male's reactions when we discussed the medical treatment, it's pretty common for people to outright refuse hormonal treatments. Generally, about 2/3 of people offered that treatment will refuse it. So that means only 1/3 of them are going to accept it. And of that third that accept it, usually about 50% of them drop out halfway through the treatment because they can't take it anymore. So what we're seeing here is not enough statistical power to be able to see the difference between the two. It's kind of like comparing 3,000 participants that went through cognitive behavioral treatment to like 10 people that went through hormonal. The numbers aren't there. It's hard to compare 3,000 to 10. And when we have a sample size issue like that, we say, we don't have enough statistical power to see a difference. So cognitive behavioral versus hormonal, we couldn't see any differences in recidivism, but it might be due to that refusal rate. However, when just looking at the studies one by one, not trying to combine them to get average treatment effects, the study that had the lowest recidivism rates and one of the largest treatment effect sizes was a study about castrated participants who did not receive any other treatments. So this alludes to the possibility that the reduction of sexual arousal alone can be effective. However, that was only one study and it was a very small sample size and it has yet to be replicated. So we don't want to say for sure, hormonal treatments are better than cognitive behavioral because like I said, that was just one study. But when we tried to combine all the hormonal studies and compare them to the cognitive behavioral, we didn't have enough statistical power to see a difference because so many people refuse that treatment that it's a sample size issue. So another finding that came from this study, which shouldn't surprise you given what we talked about last week, what they did find was that treatments that were offered in an outpatient setting, in this instance, we mean not in an institutionalized setting, when we compared the offenders that went through treatment in a community setting to treatment in an institutionalized setting, they had more successful outcomes for the offenders that were receiving treatment in the community. So this is just like what we talked about last week. Treatment is always going to be more effective in the community than it is in an institutionalized setting for two very good reasons. One, in an institutionalized setting, you have to counteract all those negative influences of being institutionalized. So even if we see like a lot of gains with the treatment, that the effects of being in prison will reduce that a little bit. So the negative effects of incarceration, but also the quality of treatment is usually better in the community than it is in a prison. You are dealing with better therapists. Usually the more expensive, better therapists either don't want to work in a prison or they don't want to make the commute. So because of the quality of the treatment and not having to deal with those negative effects, this study found that any type of sexual behavior treatment is going to be better in the community than it is when offered in an institutionalized setting. Okay, so let's talk about how effective these studies were. So looking at the average treatment effect, so looking at the cognitive behavioral and the hormonal treatments, what they found was that those offenders that attended treatment had a recidivism rate of about 19%, compared to those who did not attend treatment, their recidivism rate was about 27%. So the net effect of these programs, when analyzed, concluded that the result of treatment was 8 fewer sexual offenders out of 100 will recidivate. So that may not seem like a lot. It's definitely small, but any reduction in recidivism is a good thing, especially for this crime. These crimes can have such a lasting effect on the victims and the victims' families and friends, that if we can prevent 8 fewer out of 100, that's a good thing. So let's talk about some of the limitations of this study. So this is exactly why I want to train you guys to always read the research methods section of a study and to always read the limitations. There is no such thing as a perfect study. And by understanding how they did the research and understanding the limitations, the way that you interpret the findings can change. So the first thing that we have to note about this, when reading through the research design, the first thing is that the offenders that were included in these studies were screened on the basis of psychopathy. So if you were a psychopath, you were not included in this study. So what they were considering to be psychopaths were extensive offense history, organic brain disorders, management problems in prison, denying their offenses, withdrawing from treatment. So knowing that, we know that we can say offenders that are not pathological, that are not psychopaths, when receive treatment, these are the results that we will get. So basically, the worst of the worst were not included in this study. So that's a very important caveat when you are interpreting these results, because if you didn't know that, you would think any sex offender, regardless of how serious they are, we're going to see 8 fewer sex offenses out of 100. And that's not the case. It's for, we cannot, these treatments are way less effective for pathological offenders because they were not included in the treatment. So basically, offenders that are not psychopaths, that are not the most pathological offenders, when receiving cognitive behavioral or hormonal treatments, will result in 8 fewer sex offenses out of 100. So therefore, those treatments that were reviewed in this study can be way less effective for the most pathological offenders, right? So if you're dealing with a psychopath sex offender, we're not going to see these same results. So another reason why you got to read the research design. How are they measuring recidivism? So there are thousands of ways to measure it. Are we talking about rearrest? Are we talking about reconviction? Are we talking about reimprisonment? What are we considering recidivism? In this study, they are only counting you as a recidivist if you committed another sex offense. So what we're saying here is that this treatment cannot be generalized for non-sex offenders or for non-sex offenses, right? So in this study, if this person committed a litany of property crimes, they're still counting them as a 0 recidivism because they didn't commit another sex offense. So it's always important for you to read the research design and the limitations of the study, because that will determine how you actually interpret the findings. The last thing to note about this measure of recidivism is that they're looking at official records. And we already know that sex offenses are some of the least reported crimes. So it's possible that these effects are overestimated because these offenders can be committing crimes that we don't know about. So this is always why when I'm asking you guys to do your policy brief, one of the things you have to tell me is where the data came from. That's always important to understand when you are understanding research. So there's a real world example that is happening with this right now. So you may have seen the headlines, the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine is being, their results are being reviewed because apparently an independent panel that peer reviewed their study showed that they were using really old data. So this is exactly why we want to have other researchers looking over our shoulder. Anytime I submit an article for publication, it gets sent out to 2 or 3 experts in the field who are combing through everything that I did. So you always want, and this is why even in my intro classes, I stress that you guys should just be looking at empirical scholarly research because we know it's verified. So it's really important to have other researchers double checking what we do. And I'm trying to give you guys the tools to be able to identify if there are problems with interpretations of the study. Every time I read a news article, and they are they're saying that there's, their conclusions are based on another study. Usually there's a hyperlink for that study. I always click on the study, read through the research design and the limitations. You'd be surprised how often a news reporter misinterprets the findings of a study because they haven't read the whole thing. So again, that's part of the reason why I want to teach you guys to do this. Looking through the research design and the limitations can really change the way you actually interpret the findings of a study. All right, questions about this before we talk about electronic monitoring? Okay, so we already spoke about electronic monitoring a little bit during lecture 6, but today we're going to talk about it specifically for sex offenders. So the use of GPS technology as a supervision tool for all offenders, including sex offenders, is really growing in popularity. The largest GPS monitoring program focused on sex offenders is in the US, specifically in California. It began in 2006 with the passage of Jessica's Law. So this law mandates that all high-risk sex offenders that are being paroled have to be on electronic monitoring for the rest of their life. So right now, there are over 7,000 offenders in the state of California that are on electronic monitoring for their entire life. So let's talk about how effective this is. So we're going to talk a little bit more about these specific studies, but spoiler alert, having sex offenders on electronic monitoring seems to work pretty well. If you see that very last bullet, it does reduce recidivism for sex offenders. But first, I want to talk about why that is. So the first reason that there are 3 main reasons why researchers think having an electronic monitor on sex offenders can be effective. So the first one has to do with deterrence. So if you think way back to that 3rd lecture we had on deterrence, research has indicated that when you increase the certainty of punishment, deterrence can work. So within this context, it's very reasonable to hypothesize that location-based technology that tracks someone's movement in real time really increases the certainty of apprehension. So strapping an ankle monitor on an offender really increases the certainty that you're going to catch them doing something that they're not going to do. So the first reason electronic monitoring seems to work for sex offenders is because of that deterrent value. This is increasing the certainty of punishment, which is, of the 3 caveats of deterrence theory, that one is the most effective. So the next thing it does is it disrupts the hunting process. So anecdotal evidence has indicated that sex offenders are creatures of habit. And I've seen this amongst the several sex offenders that I have interviewed. They are usually do the same thing every day. So they are creatures of habit. And if there is a deviation from their normal daily routine, it can be an indication that this offender is on the hunt for a victim. So if the officer or agent that is watching this person is seeing that all of a sudden they're deviating from the same path that they take every day, that might be time to contact this offender or follow this offender and see what they are doing. So it gives them the time to contact the offender, investigate where they're going, and potentially intervene before the crime is committed. So during this hunting process, so like I said, they're creatures of habit. If you see them start to deviate from their routine, That might mean they're hunting for a victim. But then if you see that they are then going off, going to continuously visiting locations that are kind of offbeat, that might be an indication that this offender has found a victim and is trying to gain the trust of the victim. So again, this is where an agent can investigate the situation, contact the offender, and intervene before the crime is committed. So we think this works for sex offenders, 1, because it increases the certainty of punishment. 2, it's really easy to disrupt the hunting process if you can literally map where they're going every day and all of a sudden see them deviating. And the third reason researchers think electronic monitoring works for sex offenders is because of the omnipresence. So even if it's not working as a deterrent, and even if we're not able to disrupt the hunting process, the omnipresence of this electronic monitoring can really encourage the continued maintenance of specified treatment regimens. So under traditional parole supervision, an offender can haphazardly attend treatment and make up stories for missed sessions, but you can't really do that if a GPS monitor is strapped on your ankle. You can't claim, you ran out of gas or you had a flat tire if you were clearly sitting at home on the couch avoiding your treatment, So it makes you more likely to comply with your treatment, and we already know that treatment can be effective when it's coerced. So for those 3 reasons, researchers think electronic monitoring works for sex offenders: increasing the certainty of punishment, disrupting the hunting process, and making them comply with treatment. So lastly, we see some pretty strong evidence that these electronic monitors can be effective. We see 2 studies here that show that it can reduce recidivism for all offenders, and this 2016 study showed that it can reduce recidivism for sex offenders. In this study, the control group was twice as likely to be arrested and 3 times more likely to be arrested for failing to register. So when we have an ankle monitor on you, it's much more likely you're actually going to register as a sex offender if that's a requirement. And we also saw that there were no differences in revocation, so being revoked from your community status and spending the rest of your term incarcerated, which is really good. Usually more scrutiny means more revocations. All right, do we have any questions about this? No questions? Well, I'm sorry we didn't have time for you guys to see all the sex offenders living around you, so stay tuned. We'll do that first thing Friday morning. So on Friday, we'll talk about sex offender registration, residency restrictions. We'll check out sex offenders in your area. Spoiler alert, there's only 1 high risk near you guys. We can see the picture and click on their name to see the crimes. We'll also discuss some ridiculous Halloween policies that police officers have implemented. And we will talk about civil commitment and watch a documentary about that. Okay? If there's nothing else, I will see you guys on Friday.
Thank you, Mel.
All right. Have a good one.